If there's one thing I've learned about Christian parents and youth workers over the years, it's that they want the best for their kids. One area where many of us have struggled to teach God's best is the area of God's grand and glorious gift of sex and sexuality. That struggle is played out in the church in a variety of ways, including the fact that for our evangelical teens and young adults, sex outside of marriage has become increasingly morally acceptable. What is the extent of premarital sexual activity among our unmarried young people in the church? And how can we respond to these current trends in ways that effectively teach kids to both glorify God and experience sexual flourishing? We'll tackle these and other matters as we chat with sociologist and researcher Dr. David Ayers on this episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
So, Jason, one of the things that I think you may know about me, I'm not sure many people do know this, but when I was in college, I was a sociology major. Were you aware of that?
I was not. No.
Okay, yeah. Sociology and then a minor in anthropology, and I just loved all the social sciences. It was rather fascinating. So whenever I get a chance to interact with and talk with someone who's a sociologist, it just lights me up. I'm actually reading a book right now it just came out, called Gods of the Upper Air, which is about how the subtitle is a group of renegade sociologists and anthropologists rewrote all the narrative in our culture on race, sexuality, and gender. And it's a fascinating book written from a perspective that I'm still trying to figure out, but it's a little bit of history. So when I get a chance to interact with people in the social sciences, it's very helpful, and especially for those of us who do ministry. So did you take a sociology class, or have you done any of that?
I had considered being a sociology major, but
Okay.
it just didn't end up being the thing that I did. But yeah.
What was
But I had no idea that you had become a sociologist.
Well, I'm not a sociologist. I'm a
undergrad
sociology
years.
major, yeah. What was your major? People, I'm sure.
I double majored. I'm not doing anything close to it. I business management and communications.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, we're communicating right now, and we're going to communicate and have a great conversation with someone who actually is a sociologist. Dr. David Ayers is at Grove City College, where our good buddy Duffy Robbins is. And David is one who's done a lot of research on marriage. He's actually not only a professor of sociology there, but he's the interim provost and vice president for academic affairs. And for those not familiar with Grove City College, it's in Grove City, Pennsylvania, an absolutely stunningly beautiful campus and some incredible faculty there. We have a lot of students from our church who graduate from high school and head out to Grove City. He's written a book. It's his latest book, Christian Marriage, A Comprehensive Introduction. That came out in February of this year. And he's taught on marriage and family for well over 30 years. So, David, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So what we want to talk about today is some research that you've done, and there's a brief that's come out from the Institute for Family Studies, which you can tell us more about here, on current practices of evangelical teens and young adults. And certainly that's something that we're concerned about. Much of the conversation right now in our youth ministry world, and certainly what Jason and I are dealing with through our Sexual Integrity Initiative and what Jason's doing at Project 619 out there on the West Coast, it's dealing with matters of sexuality, and it's not just behaviors. I know a lot of what you've done in this research is about behaviors, but we want to talk as well about beliefs. And before we jump into that, I just want to share something that I found on the Grove City website, a little bit of an interview with you. There was a question that was asked of you where they asked, what is the most important piece of advice you can give students to help them succeed? I love your answer here, and I want you to talk about this because this is really at the foundation of what we're going to discuss today. But you say the chief issue for social scientists is not what is fashionable or what is politically correct or what are people willing to accept. The chief issue is what is true. Finding out what is true is hard work and often leads to taking unpopular stands and facing social pressure. And certainly that's the case for the topic we're going to deal with today. Talk a little bit about that foundational way in which you approach, the discipline of sociology, and I think we should approach all of life.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's bothered me as I've watched the social sciences unfold and even my own discipline of sociology over the last few decades is the degree to which, it's almost like, yeah, we're into sociology, but we're not into understanding society and how things really are. And sociology, that would be like I'm into cardiology, but I'm not into figuring out the human heart and how to fix it. Sociology is a tool to do what should really be our passion. Our passion is to understand social structures, social processes, social realities, regardless of what that is, and communicate that as accurately as possible. It is really hard work. We have to confront our own sinfulness. We have to confront our own biases. We have to confront the fact that we're extremely limited human beings, which means that we have to be pretty humble. We have to put our best stuff in front of other people and let them tell us what they really think, point out the flaws, work it through. And, the best sociologists do that. And interesting thing is that I get some really great stuff from Brad Wilcox, who's a Catholic conservative at University of Virginia, but I also get some great stuff from a friend of his, Nicholas Wolfinger, who's just a dead honest liberal. And when he sits down to look at data, he takes off his liberal hat and he does his honesty hat. And in that sense, sociology at its best is like journalism at its best. It's really, really difficult to find out what the truth is, because not only are humans dodgy creatures, really difficult to understand. They know when they're being studied. They alter their behavior when they're being studied. Finding out what's really going on is hard, but it's also difficult because we're sinful creatures who, even if we were sinless, we would still be terribly limited in our comprehensive understanding of the totality of reality. So if we accept the fact that it's going to be really hard work, and at the end of the day, lots of people might not like what our hard work has produced, and we're willing to live with those consequences and deal with it in an ironic, winsome way, but at the same time, not in a cowardly way, I think we can really be successful. And I think ultimately that's what people want. And if we find ourselves working with or working for people that don't want that, and we can't change their mind, then I think it's time to work with somebody else. In other words, ultimately, we want to serve folks who are willing, maybe not to agree with everything that we say, but are willing to accept our best understanding of what the truth is, and at least allow us to express that.
Before we jump into your research and what you've learned about current sexual practices of evangelical teens and young adults, just a couple of questions. I think they're related. Let's see if they're related. One would be, how has your faith, or how should our faith, inform our engagement with sociology? As a sociologist, how has your faith informed that? What makes you different as a sociologist? And then a follow-up question to that would be, for those who are listening, we have youth workers and parents who I would love for them to be engaged with sociology because it's so rich and so helpful. The social sciences are. But how what are the benefits to them? How would you push on them to engage more with the social sciences? Because we think, hey, I'm in youth ministry. I'm not necessarily sure I need to do that. There's other things I need to spend my time on. So there's a couple of questions there I mixed together.
Well, if you're really into bird watching, then to a certain extent, you probably are going to need to be into optics a bit. Now, optical devices may not be your thing, but optical devices enable you to see what it is that you are interested in. And to the extent, if you want to work with youth and parents and youth pastors and so forth, then you want to help them to see. You want them to see accurately the things that they are trying to do in light of what they accomplish. And so that also includes that you want that to help them see to what extent what they're doing is achieving the results that they hope to achieve. and recognizing that hopefully they're similar to you and that they realize that they're fallen. They realize that everything that they do isn't perfect, that they're always going to get better by the feedback of people other than themselves on what they're doing. And that multiple perspective is going to be very helpful to them. So I don't really ask youth ministers to be interested in sociology. What I would ask them to be interested in is what sociology helps them to see, that they're not going to see through some other lens. And that particularly if they've got a sociologist who loves the Lord and really cares deeply about and respects the Word of God, and has a biblical anthropology, a balanced understanding of the human person, which is not just that we're fallen, but that we're made glorious, and that glory has never been eliminated by the fall. It's been tarnished by it. Francis Schaeffer talked about the glory and the ruin of man. Every day I'm dealing with people who are infinitely valuable and capable of amazing things, amazing good, but they're dogged by sin. They're dogged by their limitations, just like I am. And so in that sense, if they have a sociologist who's going to approach things that way, they should really value that, because of course sociology has become notoriously politically correct and left-wing. But there's so many sociologists out there, Christian and non-Christians, who still take their work very seriously, just like there's a lot of journalists out there right now who still take their work very seriously and don't view it as just an ideological harangue or polemic, but really want to understand and help other people understand reality.
David, I'm going back to the comment that Walt made that it was on the website, and I'm curious if you would be able to enlighten us maybe some of the surprises that you've seen in sociology. Because one of the comments that you had made about the friend of your Catholic sociologist puts down the liberal hat. And we talked just recently a little bit about political correctness. I'm just curious if there are any studies or any sort of movement within sociology that you've seen that have surprised you most in the midst of that, with regards to not necessarily going where the data would lead, or saying something that is politically correct but may not be correct based upon data that's collected.
Well, one of the things that shocks the daylights out of me is that we have as much evidence about the harm associated with things like having children out of wedlock, having sex out of wedlock, rampant divorce rates. I mean, we all understand that correlation is not cause, but we've broken this down in so many different ways that a causal relationship is no longer a reasonable question. We have as much evidence about the destructive nature of these things, and at the same sense, the empowering positive nature, for example, of good marriages, that it exceeds what we know about tobacco use. We're more certain about the destruction caused by the abandonment of marriage and the insistence on sex and children outside of marriage. We're more certain of that than, at least if we were to be statistically honest, than we are that smoking causes cancer. And yet nobody really questions that smoking causes cancer. Nor do we worry about the self-esteem of smokers when we point that out. And yet we are paralyzed when it comes to speaking out on that. And then sometimes when we do it in bad ways. We do it in ways that are judgmental, narrow, Bible-banging, haranguing, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, it just blows my mind, because you would think that the and guys like Nicholas Wolfinger are an exception to that. But you would think that much overwhelming data would be enough to convince people to say, I'm not a Christian, I don't really believe in this stuff, I don't care if you live out of wedlock, I don't care what you do, but the fact is that here are the consequences of it, period. It'd be like if you like driving fast cars and you don't like wearing a seatbelt, go ahead and do it. Even admit to everybody that that's how you feel, but don't tell people it's not dangerous. That just doesn't make any sense. And that's what I've seen and what really bothers me. And that's just over the years redoubled my emphasis on, let's just try to seek the truth about the things that God has called us to study as best as we know how. And let's set aside fashion, let's set aside people's feelings, except in as much as Christians, we want to really honor and respect people in the way we talk about things. So that's been a surprise to me. I think a lot of academics go to graduate school assuming that everybody there is just rolling up their sleeves in a disinterested search for truth, and find out the hard way that, that's not necessarily the case.
You have been teaching for a while. This is fascinating, and I mean, we've got to get into the crux of what you have done here with this research, and we will get to that most likely after a break now. But one question before we do that. You've been teaching students for a long time. I mean, sometimes I think the long view is really helpful, especially as a social scientist. I'm sure you are just sort of anecdotally seeing data doesn't need support, the changes in the student body and their response to what you're teaching. And not just at Grove City, but I'm just saying in general, what is this kind of approach that you're talking about here, which I think is proper and is the one you've taken? It's obvious from the things you've written and from what I've heard you say before. What has been the response from emerging generations now? Have you seen a shift in how they're responding to what you're putting forth? Maybe more pushback, less pushback? What exactly has been the response among the younger generations as time has passed?
More pushback, and among people that you would think that would think of themselves, and you would think of them as more conservative in their theology and their approach, who still maybe love free market economics, but they're not really comfortable talking about LGBT stuff. They're not really comfortable about talking about living out of wedlock or the repercussions. Funny thing is, now they are comfortable about talking about the repercussions of divorce because so many of them have lived through it or watched their friends live through it. That's been a helpful thing to me. My concern is more what they do about it. Namely, they opt out of marriage and live together because of their concerns about the impact of divorce. But you can't lie to an 18-year-old and tell them that divorce doesn't hurt kids. They know it does. They watched it happen. It happened to them. So it's a mixed bag. The other thing is that they're more quick to move towards questioning your motives if they don't like what you're having to say. In other words, it doesn't seem that I can act out of, and I think I really do, that I can act out of an honest, deep concern and love for a transgender person or a gay person or somebody who's struggling with pornography. I have to somehow, if I question this and if I question the status quo or the politically correct line, it must mean I'm a homophobe, a transphobe, a bigot, and in that sense, then the conversation shuts down. And I'd have to say that those are habits they've picked up from the larger world around them. And obviously, social media hasn't helped us, has it? I mean, Twitter, I have some great interactions with people on Twitter, but to have them, I have to avoid people who seem to build up followers by saying outrageous, nasty things about other people and can't have a reasonable conversation with somebody they disagree with about anything. And they're carrying over those habits into the classroom. I think most of the students still really want to have an honest dialogue about that. But a friend of mine, a philosopher at another Christian college, indicated, he said, a small conservative college, my suspicion is that it was his, 50% of the students there now have no problem with gay marriage or homosexuality. That's consistent with the data that I see. Now, that's the other thing is, it's not everybody else, it's you. It's not them, it's us, it's here, it's now, this is where we're at. Now, I can hate them for that, or I can engage them in a constructive way. It's just harder to engage that constructively now. It evolves so quickly.
Youth workers, you need to listen to this because the important there's two strains coming through here that I'm hearing. One is, our theology. What is it that we're going to teach? And then, Jason, we talk about this a lot. The second one is our posture. How do we do that? And so there's some great insights here that we need to think about and chew on and digest a bit. We're going to take a break. We'll come back, and I want to jump into the data, what you've learned. So stick with us. In an effort to help you help the kids you know and love navigate their emerging sexuality to the glory of God, we've launched a sexual integrity initiative here at CPYU. Thanks to a generous grant from a company called DAS, You can access our Sexual Integrity Initiative and a growing number of resources for free by visiting the website at sexualintegrityinitiative.com.
Welcome back to Youth Culture Matters. We're going to dive into some of the data that you've put together specifically through the current sexual practices of evangelical teens and young adults. Before we dive into specifics, could you just give us a broad stroke, like an overview of what the study involved, what it was, and then we can dive into more of the specifics?
Well, what I did and what I've kind of done for years is, in addition to looking at social science research that's being published through various channels and trying to look at the good stuff, I've tried to track and key into large national data sets that are put together by top drawer kind of objective organizations. And the two that are really helpful, one is the General Social Survey that's been done since about 1972 by the National Opinion Research Corporation through the University of Chicago, which gives us a lot of long-term trend data, but it tends to be smaller. And then one that's really gold, but can be extremely provocative when you get into the details of it, is the National Survey for Family Growth, which since about the mid-1990s has included a separate survey of men, women, and then a pregnancy survey of women. Gets into huge numbers of people, between 4,500 and 5,000 people in each survey, and is done in cycles. Both of these surveys are done through household interview types of approaches, in which they're really good at asking sensitive questions. And so these are trained interviewers. They follow up on things. There's not a lot of concern that the respondent has misunderstood a question or is answering a different question than what was meant, both because they've been standardized so well, but because you have a trained interviewer there that's really their job is to ferret that out and to get things down right. And the National Survey of Family Growth is put out by the Center for Disease Control. And what I do with those surveys is I download them, I put them in SPSS, and I just work with them very carefully and try to pull out of that, what I can find out about these things. And both of those surveys distinguish evangelicals from everybody else. The General Social Survey even gets into questions like, what is your view of the Bible? So I can look separately at people who say they believe that the Bible is the inerrant word of God without error in its original writings. I can look at people who say they've been born again. In National Survey for Family Growth, there's several different ways to look at evangelicals. Do they call themselves an evangelical, a fundamentalist, a charismatic, or born again? Or are they members of a church that's known for being an evangelical Protestant denomination? So, for example, are they Southern Baptist? Are they PCA? Are they, North American Anglicans, that kind of thing? So it enables you to look at things in a lot of different ways.
Well, then can we dive in a little bit to some of the specifics? Because what we have here, maybe just highlight some of the very specifics that you found within the study, because I really appreciated how it was laid out, but there are some specifics just around what we're finding about premarital sexual activity and how that was broken down. So could you get into some of that as well?
Yeah, and I would just add to that as we listen to this, let's remember this. We're getting insight. This is our kids, or these are our kids. This is the reality for our kids right now. So,
yeah, this is our kids. First of all, the overwhelming majority of self-identified evangelical Protestant kids, no matter how you measure that, are having sex by the time they're 18 to 22 years old. Even, by the way, if you set aside petting, which is not measured separately, and you just look at, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to try to be too provocative here, but if you look at intercourse, oral, and anal sex, they are having sex by the time they're 18 or 22. Once they start, the number that go on to become heavily promiscuous is quite high, in the 40% range of people in 18 to 22 years of age, if they become sexually active. That's not overall, but among those who've become sexually active are getting up into 3-4 partners or more. And One of the disturbing things is that we also know that they're engaging in practices based on misperceptions about the nature of the practice. So, for example, again, I don't want to be too provocative, but I know from interacting with students that, for example, they think that something like oral stimulation is safe. Now, they know they're not going to get pregnant from it, but they think that they're not going to get a sexually transmitted disease from it. They're absolutely wrong. They're as wrong can be. And then there are practices that they have no idea how dangerous they are, like anal sex, which literally 1 out of 5 evangelical girls between the ages of 18 and 22 have allowed that to be done to them. Look, that is an extremely dangerous activity. And I'm not saying that to be insensitive to gays or anybody else. I'm just telling you from a biological standpoint, it's a very dangerous activity. And what they also don't realize is that the effect on their future marriage is profound. One of the best predictors of future divorce is multiple sex partners prior to marriage. I mean, it's just a reality. And they don't really see the connection to that. And so with that behavior, of course, their opinions are overwhelmingly supportive of premarital sex. And what I like to say about the increasing liberal views on homosexuality in the church is that, in a sense, they're just being honest and consistent. And I think to a certain extent, we need to acknowledge that. I looked at some statistics just yesterday that showed that as late as the early 2000s, the overwhelming majority of evangelicals who claimed that premarital sex, that was not wrong at all. The answer they gave on the survey is, it is not wrong at all. The overwhelming majority of those people said that homosexuality was absolutely wrong, completely wrong. Now, how do you, on the one hand, and this among people who claim to believe the Bible's the inerrant word of God. So how, on the one hand, do you say that premarital sex is perfectly fine and homosexuality is reprehensibly horrible? That's not a biblical view. That's a prejudiced view. That's a view based on emotion, visceral. It's not a thoughtful view. I would like to think that I can approach a gay person or a sexually active single Christian both from the standpoint of a compassionate engagement with them to help them to leave sin behind and to honor God with their bodies. They're each dishonoring God with their bodies in a different way. One may be in some ways worse, maybe more objectively destructive, maybe more destructive for their identity, but it's not more sinful than that. And so what I saw was that in the 2010 and beyond, like in the General Social Survey, is opposition to homosexuality collapsed among young evangelicals, but it was partly because the people who already thought premarital sex was fine just decided to be consistent. You know, if one's fine, then the other one's fine. And what that tells us too is that these areas never remain compartmentalized forever. You know, I'm a Reformed guy, I'm a Calvinist, and that means I tend to respect assumptions, and you know, I love that Dutch tradition. And one of them is that ultimately our ideas become consistent with each other over time. We're going to reconcile them and live out the implications of what we believe, and so that's what we, you know, that's what we really see there. And I'll just add one quick thing to that. What I've picked up over and over again is young people are not shocked by my statistics. Older people are. And they simply don't question it. And I've had moms tell my wife that. I had a local Christian public school teacher who's in touch with a lot of the evangelical kids in his public school told my wife, he said, I know your husband's probably getting a lot of pushback on what he said, but I want to tell you from my perspective, teaching in a public school for 25 years, he said, what he's saying is absolutely accurate. We're not shocked by it at all. My kids wouldn't be shocked by it. This is like an open secret.
I want to say something or repeat something that was in your study, and then I have a question because you brought up something I absolutely want to follow up on, but this just reinforces what you just said. It says, yet in my years of teaching in the church and in so-called evangelical higher education, it has shown me that too many spiritual leaders, educators, and parents in the evangelical world do not grasp the extent of premarital sexual activity among their unmarried young people, including the types of sexual activity being engaged in and their consequences, which we did talk about, oral and anal sex. This helps to explain the appalling inadequacy of their attempts to promote and enforce a consistent traditional sexual ethic among their singles. So again, we will give a link to this study. It's really important to be able to be aware of this. I appreciate this. I am curious with, you had mentioned that in the early 2000s there was uh, the study that was done that showed that they were okay with premarital sexual activity, not okay with same-sex sexual activity. Um, and I'm curious if there's anything, but then in 2010, there was a consistency. They kind of brought the two together in the sense that they now mirrored one another or were consistent. Is there anything in the data that you're seeing now that does that same thing that you think is going to shift in 10 years?
Well, I think we're going to. I think we're going to see. Now, it gets into areas outside of sexual activity per se, but we're already seeing a huge shift on the whole transgender thing. I mean, a huge shift. And the other thing we're seeing more and more is a a rejection of a lot of the basic categories that we've even taken for granted. So, for example, a lot of our young evangelicals no longer really think of homosexual and heterosexual. So, for example, right now, well over 1 out of 10 girls, young women in evangelical churches, well over 1 out of 10, and that's in the National Survey of Family Growth. And I got that. I did not put that in this report. I wanted to focus more on the heterosexual world. But well over 1 out of 10 of them has had sex with another woman. And we're talking about kids as young as 17, 18, 19 years old. But what research is telling us, and in fact, Washington Post ran an article on this called Partway Gay, is that they don't think of themselves as homosexual. They don't even really think of themselves as bisexual. This is just something I do.
Right. There's no, so just to clarify there's no sort of quote unquote classical sense of, I've been feeling these urges my whole life. Now I'm indulging them.
Absolutely not. Yeah. So that what it means is that their identity as a heterosexual is not necessarily, for example, being threatened, if they even have that identity at all, or if that identity even matters to them. And I think those things are really out on the frontier now. And I think another thing is that I think pornography is hitting our kids like a ton of bricks. I'm trying to imagine when I was 15 years old, if I could have accessed any kind of pornography anytime I wanted, anonymously, 24/7, for free. I think I would have been destroyed by it. And frankly, right now, what I'm finding is that I do premarital counseling and different things like that. I'm dealing with almost no young men who haven't struggled with pornography at some level. And it's turning that and the video games and a lot of the lack of maturity is turning off a lot of our young evangelical women to the young men. They're basically it's hurting their relationship with them. It's hurting their perception of them, and it's hurting their ability to think of them as somebody that they can connect to and live their life with and depend on over the years. And it is a huge hurdle. In premarital counseling now, I think dealing with those kinds of sexual indiscretions in the past of the people we're dealing with, especially the young men, is now something we almost automatically have to do. And I just try to let it come forward naturally, but I'm never surprised that it does, and it almost always does.
Boy, this is, as you're saying this, I mean, absolutely. And Jason, you and I have talked about this. We see this among kids, and we see either an unwillingness to teach to these things because people don't know how to teach them, or they're scared to teach them, or they don't think these realities exist, or there's a wholesale accommodation to these realities that are out there. And the cultural narrative is certainly taking over the biblical narrative in terms of where people land, and it's frightening. As you're talking, I want to say something about this because you mentioned pornography, and I was thinking about this when you talked about vaginal sexual intercourse or oral sex or anal sex. I had a conversation with someone who does some counseling, and this was not, I don't know who was actually involved in this, but basically when we were talking about these matters of sexuality very recently, he was telling me about an evangelical pastor who his marriage is in trouble because he is demanding that his wife engage in anal sex. She's refusing, and he says this is a deal breaker. This is a deal breaker for our marriage. I mean, when you hear these things, first off, you're going, okay, what has nurtured us into this way of thinking where we get to this point? And then what are the things that can nurture us out of this? You know, how can we reboot and get on the right path and correct these horrible, destructive ways of thinking that undermine our flourishing? Yeah, I'm just saying that. I'm just sharing that. I don't know what the response can be to that, but I was dumbfounded by this.
Well, you know, one of the things that disturbed me the most in looking at this, and I have 4 daughters, and to me they're princesses. I mean, you know, they're intelligent, they're wonderful to be around. I can't imagine any man that wouldn't who's going to marry them that wouldn't want to treasure them and wouldn't want to honor them and all that. And you know, when I look at what young men are demanding from these girls, you know, what I saw in anal sex, what I saw with regards to women servicing men in other ways, and the ages at which this is occurring. Well, to me, and I can't prove this, but it's a direct line from pornography. And that is going to decimate their marriages. It's going to go right into their marriages because suddenly, you know, their wife to be satisfying to them or their girlfriend to be satisfying to them has to be just like this woman on the porn video. And these women who are in the porn industry are wrecked characterologically. They're wrecked emotionally. Their lifespans are very short. They oftentimes have to heavily use drugs to get themselves to do it. And yet, here's a Baptist kid in Des Moines, Iowa, who now wants this from his girlfriend, and thinks there's something wrong with her if she's not comfortable with that. Well, that's a terrible way to. And I'm all for a great deal of freedom in how a couple chooses to be with each other sexually within certain boundaries. But that certainly should not be informed or guided by something as awful as a mob-run, organized crime-run, multi-billion-dollar human sex trafficking industry that does nothing but wreck human lives.
That's good. Listen, we need to take a break, but just to say when we come back, I want to get into practical responses. And this is where 2 things I'd love to hear from you. You just said you're a father. You said 4 daughters? You have 4 daughters? Yeah. So you have daughters. As father of daughters, what do we as parents and people in youth ministry need to be teaching our sons? And then obviously you're engaged in teaching your daughters. What do we need to be teaching our girls? And, you know, from the perspective, you're wearing multiple hats here. You know, you're a follower of Christ, you're a sociologist, you're a dad, you're someone who works with young people, you care deeply about these things. When we come back, I really want to work to unpack that. Stick with us. Tens of thousands of kids have been trained by their parents and youth workers to think Christianly about music and media with our How to Use Your Head to Guard Your Heart 3D guide to making wise media choices. This easy-to-use teaching tool needs to be in your youth ministry toolbox if you desire to teach your students to integrate their faith into all of life. Jesus calls us to follow him, and that includes following him into the 6 to 9 hours a day of screen time that shape and mold the beliefs and behaviors of our kids. To learn more about our 3D Media Evaluation Guide and to order a copy for every member of your youth group, go to our website at cpyu.org. Teach your kids to engage with media to the glory of God.
Welcome back to Youth Culture Matters. We're going to do a quick flyover before we just dive into some of the practical, because what we've realized is that there are some statistical points that we should point to, show. We've given a broad stroke, but can you just fly over some of the main points with regards to some of the activity that you did see? Because we have said it, it's surprising, but if we could just get some specifics, maybe 4 or 5 statistical points that we could point to as we get into the practical.
Happy to. Yeah, I'll focus on behavior.
Yeah.
First of all, about 1/4 of evangelical kids between 15 and 17 have had sexual intercourse. By the time they're 18 to 22, 2/3 of them have had sexual intercourse. Um, about 2/3 of the statistics are about the same for oral sex with an opposite sex partner. Um, about one out of about 7% of evangelical teens between 15 and 17, about 7% have had anal sex, opposite gender anal sex, and about 1/5 between 18 and 22 have had opposite sex anal sex. And the among 15 and 17, if you take all sexual activity combined and you don't include what we used to call petting, the numbers are well over 40% of both boys and girls have engaged in some kind of sexual activity by the time they're 15 to 17 years old. And we're up in 3/4, about 3 out of 4 have engaged in some kind of sexual activity by the time they're 18 to 22 years old. Literally, if you take evangelical Protestants, if they become sexually active, this isn't overall, but if they become sexually active between 15 and 17 years old, among those who became sexually active, 35% of those kids have already had at least 4 separate sex partners. And among those who are 18 to 22 years old, if they become sexually active at all, and so the key is to stop them from ever becoming sexually active, over half of them have had 4 or more sex partners. And I'm trying to help us to wrap our mind around an 18 to 22-year-old young person who's had sex with 4 or more separate people.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those. It's really interesting to me. I know because we're going to get into the practical now. We just did a little project here on a chatbot. We put out a trend alert on a chatbot that Planned Parenthood put up earlier this year called Rue, which exists to answer, self-described as answering all the questions kids have about sexuality, sex, gender, so forth and so on. A kid can ask anything anonymously. And in a world where there is a real void of positive biblical sex education that really understands personhood and the glory of God's good gift of sex and sexuality, in that void has stepped the cultural narrative, and this is just one example of an outlet, an educator, we would say. And if folks want to learn about that, go to our website. You can find that trend alert. But now let's talk. Let's shift, in the last few minutes we have together to how we address this. And I asked you before, what do we need to be teaching the boys that are in the world of your daughters, and what do we need to be teaching our daughters who are in the world of your home there? How can we as parents and youth workers really push back on this and recover a biblical narrative for God's good gift of sex and sexuality?
Well, if I could say real quickly for both boys and girls, we need to get them to church regularly, and we need to help them to understand that their faith is something that's to be lived every hour of every day, 7 days a week. In other words, a real involvement in the religious life of the church, because that's where the blood flows. We can have the best teaching, the best ministry in the world, but if they're not there, they don't get the blood. And so we need to make sure that they're organically connected. We need to look beyond ourselves as parents and look at the larger community and how God has put them there to help us and to support us in our work. And frankly, and many times our kids might be more comfortable going to them first than us. As long as they're going to somebody who's going to teach them biblical truth and listen to them and really help them to follow Christ. I don't want to be too hung up. I mean, I'm hoping eventually I can have that conversation with my kid, but I want them to be having them with someone.
Yeah, David, in response to that, real quickly, is it fair to say, I think that you would go down this road, that when you talk about getting them to church and being involved in church, you're looking at the full intergenerational, breadth, width, depth of the body of Christ, as opposed to just bringing them to church and having them with their peers for just all age-segregated activities?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Look, I learned a lot of things about my grandfather when I was older that just shocked me, and I had no idea what he'd lived through. I had no idea that his younger sister got pregnant out of wedlock and committed suicide. I had no idea about some of the things that he dealt with. I had no idea until I was well into my adult years that my mother had to deal with an alcoholic and philandering dad. And yet, the fact is that the collective wisdom of the generations of the body of Christ, all the diversity that we bring to bear there, is all part of God's provision for our young people. It's not just about us. It's not just about youth ministers and peer groups, although that's a vital and extremely important part of what we're doing. It's a whole orbed kind of thing, and we should never second guess who our kids are going to really connect with. We might be surprised who they really connect with and what they get through those connections.
Sorry to interrupt you. Go carry on with some of your recommendations.
Well, on girls, first of all, I think it's really vital, and I know this has oftentimes been said, but to me, it can never become said too much, is that as much as possible, they should have a very constructive relationship with their dad, who should adore them and should respect them and should care about what they think and should teach them to bear themselves with respect. And every day, those girls should be watching me or all of us how we treat their mother. And by the way, even in damaged or divorce situations, I've seen that even in some of the worst situations, men can step up and become a vital part of their kids' lives and still continue to show that respect. So I would even say, look, if you're divorced from your wife and she's got custody of the kids and you maybe don't even like each other anymore, they should see nothing but respect by the way that you treat their mother, because the fact is that speaks volumes to them about how they should expect to be treated by other people, and that they're carrying in their own bodies a healthy self-regard. By the way, we shouldn't be praising them constantly for how they look, but we should be okay with praising how they look. But they shouldn't be hung up on the idea that if they're a little homely, it means that they're not valuable, that they're not a treasure, that they're not somebody with a great life ahead of them, not only in their careers, but in their calling as wives and moms. Their emphasis should not be on the wrong things. And in that sense, I think that's just really vital. And again, I think for our young men, I think we've fallen off the wrong side of the log in terms of a positive masculinity that has at its core the respect and protection and care of women, but not in a way that ever diminishes the regard that you have for them. But that in a sense, look, I would hope to think that my teenage sons would be a force to contend with if they saw their younger sister being bullied, belittled, or put down by boys at school. I would hope that they would step up to the plate. Maybe not like it was in my baby boom generation, where you took it back, but it certainly should be dealt with. It should be addressed, because in that sense they're learning what it means to be a whole Christian man towards the women in their lives. Masculinity does not have to become misogyny, but it can be a positive regard for the women in your life. And again, I would say too that the boys are going to learn how to treat women by the way that we treat our wives in their presence, and the other women in our lives, our coworkers, their grandparent, their grandmothers, and everything else, and how we basically take care of them. I would love to see a world come back. It's kind of funny. You ever notice what a phenomena things like Pride and Prejudice and Downton Abbey are? Think how coarse our culture is, right? And I think it's because people are craving that. We don't want the hypocrisy side of it. Maybe even don't want the elitist side of it. But the side of it where a woman walks in the room and all the men stand up. That's not the worst thing in the world. A society in which men don't just utter profanities in front of women, they shouldn't be uttering profanities at all, don't get me wrong. But there should be a special regard there. And some of those old manners and civilities are not, we're not about putting women down or keeping them in their place. They were about basically an elevated civility in our social life and our interaction with each other that speaks positively about the positive aspects of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman.
As we finish up here, and I really appreciate this conversation so much, but would you point us to any resources that you think would be helpful for youth workers and for parents? Obviously we'll put a link to your book, we'll put a link to the study there. Anything else you would recommend that would be helpful as we navigate these issues?
Well, I'm currently in the process of writing a book just on this topic alone, but that won't be out for probably a year and a half. I love Harvest USA materials. I just love what they do. I love the Passport to Purity materials. And we walked our kids through all those. Anything that you can get that's going to help. One thing I've been shocked by is how many evangelical young people have never had any honest dialogue with sex with their pastors or with even their parents. And any resources that help you to really tackle that in a rot-gut honest way, but in a way that really keeps God and His world and the beauty of it all in the center of it, I think it's going to be extremely helpful.
Yeah, that's good. I'm just going to say this when you say how you're surprised about the number of pastors who haven't had these conversations. It's youth pastors as well, and I was at a church, I won't say where it was, a couple of years ago. They had me come in on a Saturday and speak to parents and adults about something other than sexuality. I think we're talking about kids and technology. And they asked me to stay over on Sunday to speak to the students about pornography in the morning, middle school and high school. And I said to the two full-time youth workers, one middle school, one high school, what have you taught them so far? And they both said, well, we've both been here 7 years and we have never broached the subject. They've never talked about it. And I'm thinking, well, this contributes. I don't know if we're scared to talk about it or we don't know what to talk about it, but we have to get over our fear. We have to talk about it, have to equip ourselves to, because the culture is certainly, our kids have their smartphones. Culture's talking about this 24/7, speaking into their lives. And so we need to teach the truth. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to remind people we are going to put links to all the resources up. We'll link you to everything from Grove City College to the study to books to our Sexual Integrity Initiative. You can learn more about what David Ayers is doing, and we'll track with him in the future. We hope to have him back. I can't wait till this next book comes out. What is the title? Do you have a working title? Or
working title is Sex and the Single Evangelical.
Okay, that sounds awesome, because that's an issue we need to certainly address and prepare our kids for as well. We've I think many times denigrated those who are single or somehow seen them as second-class citizens, and so we'll look forward to that. But go to our homepage, cpyu.org, click on the player for this particular podcast, and you will find listed below. Chris Wagner's going to put them there, all of the links to everything that's mentioned here. And we'll remind you as well, talk to your friends, share the podcast with your friends, and invite them to subscribe. Anywhere you get your podcasts, you can subscribe to Youth Culture Matters. So until we're together again, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time on the next episode of Youth Culture Matters.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.